This episode starts in a very true crime sort of way, so let's get into it. It's June 25th, 1906, and we're on the rooftop theater of Madison Square Garden. A new play is opening called Mam'selle Champagne. It's actually written by Edgar Allan Poe, who would go on to co-author the Wizard of Oz film. But this musical, historically speaking, sucks ass. But no one's going to know how much it sucks on this opening night, because something else much more interesting is about to happen. Something that pulls focus from the stage. A woman named Evelyn Nesbit and her millionaire husband, Harry Thaw, had bought tickets to the premiere. But Evelyn is nervous because Madison Square Garden is a danger zone. Because the noted architect who actually designed this rooftop, and the guy who also made the arch in Washington Square Park, named Stanford White, might be there. And he, historically speaking, is a huge pile of shit. And Evelyn has a very twisted history with him. When they arrive, Evelyn frantically searches the room, checks out Stanford's usual box seat, and sees that he's not there. She's like, oh, thank God, there won't be any drama. But then, after the show had already started, Stanford shows up. Time slows for Evelyn as she watches him sneak in and cross the room. He sits at a random table, in full view from where Harry and Evelyn are seated. She looks at her husband, who instantly becomes tense. They lock eyes, and Evelyn's like, this show kind of sucks, do you want to go? And Harry is like, yeah, it's terrible, and they gather their things. As they walk towards the elevator, the up-tempo signature tune from the show begins. It's called I Could Love a Million Girls. But then, Harry pauses, turns around, and looks back at Stanford. Suddenly, Harry walks boldly towards Stanford's table and stands behind him for a moment. And then, Harry pulls out his gun and shoots Stanford in the shoulder. Before Stanford has time to realize what's happening, Harry circles around to face him and fires again. This second bullet kills him instantly. He slumps to the floor, dead ass. At first, the audience thinks this is part of the show. A few scenes back, there had been a duel, so they all started laughing. The actors, though, are like, what the frick, and stop performing. The stage manager is pissed and shouts from the wings, keep singing! But then eventually, everyone realizes, oh shit balls, this is real. And mayhem ensues. After this shooting, there's a sensational trial. And everyone in New York City society learns about the chaotic, lurid, and violent love triangle of Evelyn Nesbit, Harry Thaw, and Stanford White. R.I.P. And shooters, that's what this episode is about how this murder came to be. Theme song. This is American Filth. I'm Gabby Watts. Every week I tell you a filthy story from American history. Today's episode, Evelyn Nesbit and her problematic boys. Before you go too much further into this episode, there is a description of sexual assault on this show. I like it to be zany and fun, but sometimes history has other plans. Evelyn Nesbit was born just outside of Pittsburgh on Christmas Day, 1884. When she was 12 years old, her father, a lawyer, died from spinal meningitis, leaving his family to fend for themselves. But, since bacteria wasn't a thing yet, the newspapers at the time said that he had wheeled himself to death, aka he got a disease from riding his bike too much. So watch out, cyclists, you might get meningitis. Evelyn's father was deeply in debt when he died. So Evelyn's mom, Florence, was like, fuck, we need money and I can't make enough to support us. So she looked at her daughter and was like, Evelyn, you're hot. So you're gonna model to make us money. And Evelyn was like, oh, thanks, Mom. I love being 13 and using my body to support you and my younger brother. Thank you for this opportunity. But she was a great model. Her modeling was raking in good cash for the family, and they realized they could make even more money in New York. So Evelyn's mom was like, kids, let's go to the big city. When they first got to New York, though, Evelyn's mom, she did try to make a living as a clothing designer, but that didn't work. So again, Evelyn went to model. Almost immediately, she was getting offers from all sorts of dudes. She was like, oh my God, all these men, they want me to come to their studios and paint me or photograph me, whatever. And she started making lots of dollars. Making her way in that world, Evelyn caught the eye of Charles Dana Gibson, whose drawing of her, published in 1890, is now iconic. You'd know it if you saw it. It's a woman's face in profile with her hair cascading down into what looks like a question mark. The piece is called Women, the Eternal Question. Yes, women are a mystery. How will we ever know what's going on in our little tiny bird brains? I mean, truly, a woman's body is a wonderland, in that the medical establishment wonders how it works. Anyway, this image of Evelyn was the first of what became known as the Gibson Girls, Dana Gibson's series of drawings depicting the new woman, the modern lady, the ideal. And what was a modern woman, you ask? Well, sometimes they wore their hair up, and sometimes half up, half down. Wow. They read books and played sports and could challenge men intellectually while also being demure and not taking up too much space and also being really good at dancing. Evelyn's face was soon all over New York City. Everyone wanted to draw and photograph her, and she became this Edwardian symbol for charm, elegance, and innocence. In some of the images, she had a sweet smile on her face. She wears a nightgown or flowing dress that's casually falling off one shoulder. Other images are more modest. She wears frilly lace and holds flowers with a sly smile. But for women like Evelyn, life was not easy, breezy, beautiful. Oh no. Bad shit was happening to hot women who the men of the New York elite gawked at. And I just want to tell you about this one lady just to give you a sense of what Evelyn was walking into once she was in New York. In 1895, there was a 16-year-old girl named Susie Johnson, and she had been hired by an older man to attend his party and jump out of a pie, which, jumping out of pies and cakes, that was happening a lot back then. When Susie Johnson jumped out from the center of this particular fake pastry, she looked around and there were only men sitting around a long table. Naughty pictures lined the walls, and all the guests wore golden laurels on their heads. These were the elite men of New York at the time, and Dana Gibson and Stanford White were among them. But after this infamous party, Susie disappeared, and the police showed little interest in helping to search for her. The press went nuts. Her story became a cautionary tale about what happens when women show too much skin and participate in midnight revelry. She was said to have, quote, posed by electric light, a euphemism for sex work. One of the illustrations in the paper shows Susie popping out of the pie, surrounded by men with carving knives. An exaggeration? Maybe not so much. Stanford White is in the foreground with an especially large blade in hand. It apparently had been his idea to do the pie thing. But while she fell from grace, these men's reputations were untarnished. Their carnal appetites unpunished, even rewarded. Susie was eventually found many years later. She had been shamed into obscurity. All this to say that these men were not just filthy, gross dudes. There was some sadistic shit going on, and Evelyn Nesbit walked right into the lion's den. By October 1901, Evelyn was a chorus girl on Broadway. She had a small ensemble role in the successful musical Florodora. In the crowd one night was Stanford White, the famous architect, the dude who would be shot later. And this was big for Evelyn because he was a man of great status in the world of the arts. The story goes he saw her from his orchestra seat and thought she was hot AF. After the show, he approached another cast member, Edna Goodrich, and said that she must introduce him to the beautiful new girl. And then he invited both of them to a luncheon at his home. In her book, Prodigal Days, published in 1934, Evelyn recalls walking into Stanford's luxurious home. There was lavish furniture covered in velvet with thick red blackout curtains. Still, the room was well lit, as indirect lighting was kind of a new thing. Evelyn called it a startling innovation. Lighting is so important. In the room were the two women, Evelyn and her friend Edna, and there's Stanford White, and he invited another man who was presumably there to keep Edna busy while Stanford got to know young Evelyn privately. I love where this is going. Evelyn was used to being gawked at professionally, but Stanford seemed genuinely interested in who she was. And she was a bit hypnotized by his winning combination of gravitas and tenderness. Not Freudian at all. Not to mention knowing him and having his respect could only serve her career. That day, Evelyn tried champagne for the first time, and Stanford insisted that she only have one. He took her upstairs, and they entered a grand room that had a large bed, a sitting area, and an enormous red velvet swing with thick red velvet ropes that extended from the ceiling. So Evelyn, 17, sat in the swing as this man, 47, pushed her. So not only was there this swing, there was also this piece of rice paper on the ceiling. And this was kind of common back then, if you were someone who did have a swing inside, I'm sure everyone had that. Usually there would also be a piece of rice paper on the ceiling. And the idea was that the person swinging could try to break it with their feet. Why? No fucking clue. I don't think they invented beer pong yet, so they needed something to do. But it was a thing, and that's what Evelyn was trying to do. And she was successful. She kicked her way through the rice paper. And Evelyn, being 17, she just thought that they were having a nice LOL, just having a little fun. But in her autobiography, Story of My Life, published in 1914, she said, "I did not realize that childish fun could have any serious significance. I did not realize that this kindly man could have any other object in view than to amuse me." This was a huge day, though, for Evelyn, because, for lack of a better term, she basically became his sugar baby. He took her under his wing and began supporting her and her family financially. And actually, his first order of business was getting her teeth fixed. One of her front teeth was chipped. Stanford also paid for Evelyn, her mother, and her brother to move into a fancy apartment on 24th Street. Then he sent her brother away to boarding school. He introduced Evelyn to all his elite New York friends, ensuring her place in high society. But if you can imagine, a 47-year-old financially supporting a 17-year-old, his intentions weren't great. Can you believe it? And this is the part of the episode where we have a scene of sexual assault, so if you're uncomfortable, just skip ahead. One weekend, Stanford convinced Evelyn's mother to go out of town for some made-up errand. Florence was worried about leaving her underage daughter alone in the city, but Stanford was like, "Don't worry about it. I'll take care of her. She's like a daughter to me." But this creep had other plans. Stanford invited Evelyn to a party. He said it was going to be big and grandiose and packed to the gills. But when she showed up, she was the only one there. Alert, alert. They hung out in the room with the swing, and then Stanford handed Evelyn a beautiful yellow kimono that she slipped on, and he insisted she drink his champagne. Usually, he advised her not to drink. He was like, "You gotta stay sober and classy, but not tonight." He wanted her inhibitions gone. He led her to another room in his mansion. It was walled with mirrors, including one in the canopy of the bed. And this bed was the only piece of furniture in this room. Later in court, Evelyn explained from the witness stand that when she got to that room, her head was pounding and she lost her vision and collapsed. Hours later, she woke up, naked, next to Stanford. In the mirror above her, she saw blood on the sheets and she screamed. Stanford was sitting up, smoking a cigar. He assured her that everything was fine. This is what grown-ups do. He said everyone does it, and no one talks about it. Fucking horrific, guys. We'll be right back. After what happened in the mirrored room, Evelyn was basically trauma bonded to her sponsor, Stanford White. She was completely codependent, seeking his approval for every little thing and refusing to speak against him to anyone. Her days were spent glued to his side, in what she may have thought to be a healthy relationship, one that made sense for her and her family. But that incident in the room with the mirrors was not the last of its kind. Their sexual relationship was a secret, so in public they dated other people. At first to keep up appearances, but eventually Stanford tired of Evelyn, and Evelyn tired of being dismissed by him all the time. She got sick of watching him shamelessly take advantage of other young women. So she started dating John Barrymore, who is, yes, Nepo baby Drew Barrymore's granddad. John was her age and actually very nice, and she fell hard for him. It was a sweet romance. He was an illustrator and cartoonist at the time, though, and not responsible with his finances. Both Florence, Evelyn's mother, and Stanford White did not approve of him. Plus, Stanford's narcissism really left little room for Evelyn to have a life of her own. So, to stop this relationship, what he did is Stanford enrolled her in a boarding school in New Jersey. And before she left, John Barrymore proposed to her. But she, under the influence of her mom and Stanford, said no. And then Evelyn met Harry Thaw. Harry had also seen Evelyn on stage and became enchanted by her beauty. He had attended 40 performances of The Wild Rose, which she had been cast in. It was because of her that the show did well, even though she didn't have a leading role. Harry was heir to a $40 million railroad fortune. He got kicked out of a bunch of fancy schools, including Harvard, and then realized that he was rich, so he doesn't need to go to school. That's crazy. Harry was a very spoiled man-baby fuckboy with a history of mental illness. Some sources say that he was into some underground BDSM stuff, but those could also have just been lies that Stanford spread about him, because he's a petty little bitch. But anyway, Harry was obsessed with Evelyn. She'd seen him at a lot of parties, but she was typically distracted by Stanford or Barrymore or the many other men fawning over her. But now that she was away at school, Harry pursued her with everything he had. Their relationship became more serious when Evelyn needed an emergency appendectomy. Some people think that Evelyn was actually pregnant, potentially with John Barrymore's child, and ended the pregnancy that day. But whatever the case, Harry saw his in. He used his money and influence to ensure Evelyn had the highest quality care possible while she recovered. And when she was well enough, he invited her and her mother on an epic trip to Europe. He paid for and planned everything to a T, so much so that Florence was soon annoyed at how active they were. Eventually, Florence was like, "This is dumb and you two are so smitten. It's annoying. I'm going home. Evelyn, you're a grown-ass woman. You'll be fine. Goodbye." While they were on their trip in Europe, Evelyn noticed something about Harry. He seemed kind of obsessed with Stanford White. Like, some people think that Harry was jealous of him, believing that Stanford was getting in the way of Harry entering status and influence in the class of New York elite. It was a somewhat niche group, and he thought Stanford was in the way. And while they were on their trip, Harry was asking Evelyn about him constantly, trying to pull information out of her, anything he could use against him. During the trip, Harry tried again to convince Evelyn to marry him. She wouldn't. Evelyn partly refused because she was deeply ashamed of what had happened with Stanford and thought Harry could never love her if he knew. But one night in Europe, they got wasted, and Evelyn spilled the beans, explaining all the terrible stuff she'd been through with Stanford. In her 1914 memoir, Evelyn recalls Harry bursting into tears, crying with her, head in hands. She writes about how touched she was by his empathy and how in touch with his emotions he was. Yes, a sensitive soy boy. And it was a cathartic moment for her, as she had never shared this with anyone, never spoken those words aloud. And Harry's dramatic reaction made her realize how wrong the things really were between her and Stanford. Harry muttered, "Poor child," as he wept. When Evelyn returned from Europe, Harry stayed behind. She had no choice but to reconnect with her keeper, Stanford White. Stanford and a lot of other people keep telling her that Harry's a bad guy. He's dangerous, he said. Evelyn was turned off enough that when Harry finally returned from his travels, she ghosted him. But he's not good at taking a hint, so he wrote her letter after letter until she agreed to see him. When they met up, she remembered that she liked him, and he said he doesn't care a thing about what happened in her sex life. He's in love. And after much convincing, Evelyn finally agreed to marry Harry. And remember, Harry's super rich, and his family didn't approve of Evelyn. She was a lowly chorus girl. But despite that, Harry's boyish infatuation with her remained unwavering. But the thing is, once they were married, Harry's poor and unchecked mental health began to show. He was possessive, jealous. He had Evelyn followed. He was desperate to know her whereabouts at all times. One time, he found out that she'd gone to see Stanford White in secret. He flew into a rage, and Evelyn started to be afraid of her husband. And then, a few weeks later, they got those tickets to see that terrible show, Mam'zelle Champagne. Before they went to the show, they joined some friends for dinner. And Evelyn remembered Harry acting strange. He was more aloof than usual and irritable. Suddenly she looked up and saw that Stanford White was there, walking through the restaurant. Harry didn't notice, but they had made a deal. If either of them saw Stanford, they would signal to the other. So Evelyn asked the waiter for a pen and slipped Harry a note saying, "He's here." But okay, now we're back at the introduction of the whole episode, blah, 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 blah. They leave the restaurant, they go to the show, they're all nervous, they don't see Stanford, but then he sits down near them. They decide to leave, but then Harry decides instead to shoot his ass, twice, blah, blah, blah. Everyone thinks the gun is part of the show, but then everyone realizes it's not, and chaos ensues. Everyone in the audience clamors through the door, running for their lives. Women scream, dishes clatter to the floor, and distant sirens approach. After he shot Stanford, Harry just stands there, holding his golden revolver in the air above his head, a signal that he's done shooting. Some reported it seemed as though he was waiting for someone to take his gun away. Evelyn stands there, just shocked, like, what the hell, man? Why did you kill him? And Harry approaches her, kisses her mouth, and says, "It's all right, dear. I probably saved your life." As the firemen seize him and pull him towards the elevators, Harry mumbles quietly, "I did it. I did it because he ruined my wife." The firemen hand him over to the police, and he's brought to the 30th Street precinct. And by the next morning, Harry, Stanford, and Evelyn were front-page news. Many would call this court proceeding the trial of the century, even though it was only 1906, so they really had a lot more years ahead of them. Anyway, the press was absolutely brutal, very sensational. Big publications were printing direct transcripts of the trial, which included Evelyn's harrowing and detailed testimony about her relationship with Stanford White. She explained in painful detail about the incident when he drugged her and she woke up naked. She wept on the stand in fear and shame. The publishing of these scandalous details made a lot of people mad, like Christian temperance groups throughout the city. And historians think it's kind of unclear what Evelyn's motivations were to be so candid about Stanford. Some think that maybe she was coached and paid by the Thaw family to protect her husband's reputation. And then Florence, Evelyn's mom, was curiously MIA throughout this whole thing. Some people think Harry's lawyers threatened to accuse her of prostituting her daughter out to Stanford White. And then Evelyn's brother was upset because he had seen Stanford as a father figure and blamed Evelyn for his death. So Harry's lawyers were pushing for a plea of temporary insanity. So they leaned into the narrative that he was outraged at Stanford's treatment of young girls and that he was defending his wife's honor. Evelyn at this point, though, was even more afraid of him. And she fell in line, desperate to just be free from the chains of her violent husband. Harry was tried twice for his crime. The first time, the jury deliberated for 47 hours, only to come out in a deadlock. And then at the second trial, he was found not guilty on the grounds of insanity. He was sentenced to a mental hospital in Beacon, New York. And this whole process with the 2 trials, it lasted 2 years, finally concluding in February of 1908. So that means for 2 whole years, Evelyn's life was on display in a way that was completely out of her control. So Stanford's dead. Harry was in a mental hospital for a time. And what happened to Evelyn? 2 years after the trial, Evelyn gave birth to a little boy in Berlin, Germany. She named him Russell William Thaw. Evelyn insisted that her son was Harry's, but Harry denied paternity, and the 2 divorced. Evelyn continued performing on stage, in the vaudeville circuit, and in silent film. She toured around the world with a dance partner who then she married in 1916. They had an extremely successful show that packed houses for 2 years. But her notoriety became too much for her husband, and he left her in 1918. She also started doing burlesque and opened a tea room in New York City. She and Harry saw each other from time to time, and the newspapers would speculate about their relationship status whenever possible. And she was truly never out of the limelight after this. Kind of ruined her life. She struggled with addiction to both alcohol and morphine. And then on New Year's Eve, 1925, she attempted suicide by drinking disinfectant. It was reported that she would have died if her stomach wasn't filled with gin. Finally, she moved out to sunny California, where she pursued a simpler life as a sculptor. She taught ceramics because apparently she was good at that too, and helped her son raise his kid until her death. She died in Santa Monica at age 82. God, this was a brutal episode, lots of twists and turns. But don't worry, the next one is going to be a little less crazy and more dumb because it is about cheese. Clearly, Stanford, Evelyn, Harry didn't turn out well for any of them. The one thing that did benefit from this was that terrible play, Mademoiselle Champagne, the show where Harry shot Stanford. It ended up having a 60-show run, and people said it was really terrible, but the reason it was able to do 60 shows was because of the publicity from the murder. I think that's a pretty strange reason to go to a play, is people get killed here. So I guess the lesson of this episode is if you write a musical that's shitty enough, people might die. So let's do some revisions, people. Let's make it good. The stakes are high. Guys, thanks for listening to the episode. We'll be back next week with more stuff. American Filth is a production of School of Humans and iHeart Podcasts. I'm your host, Gabby Watts. This episode was written by Julie Christgau. Our theme song is by Jesse Neiswanger and me. Our senior producer is Amelia Brock, and our executive producers are Virginia Prescott, Brandon Barr, and Elsie Crowley. Please like, subscribe, review the show wherever you listen to podcasts, and make it nice or funny, whatever. And you can follow the show on Instagram at American Filth Pod. Talk at you next time. XOXO, Gossip Girl.